Ladies and gentlemen, good afternoon. My name is Bill Bridge, and I serve on the faculty of the law of the Dedman School of Law. And I'm happy to welcome you to this program. President Turner is out of town, but he asked me to extend a warm welcome to the campus to all our visitors this afternoon. In May of 2012, Dallas Mayor Mike Rawlings appointed a Blue Ribbon Committee to prepare the city to honor in an appropriate way the 50th anniversary of the assassination of President Kennedy. He named as chair of that committee SMU alumna and trustee Ruth Altshuler. In cooperation with that citywide committee, Southern Methodist University, the John Goodwin Tower Center for Political Studies, the SMU Law School, the Sixth Floor Museum, and the George W. Bush Presidential Center formed a committee to organize academic programs throughout this period of commemoration. The first program was on President's Day 2013 and featured three historians who spoke about the politics of memory. The final program will be in President's Day 2014, when, in cooperation, I think, with the LBJ Library as well, we're going to do a program on presidencies in crisis. So there are a series of programs. You should pay attention to the website, however you found out about this program, to the Sixth Floor Museum website, the Tower Center website, for other programs. This afternoon's program, it brings together for the first time in 50 years staff members from the Presidential Commission, which President Johnson formed within the week of the assassination of President Kennedy, chaired by Chief Justice Earl Warren, popularly known as the Warren Commission. Each of these gentlemen served as lawyers for the Warren Commission and had pieces of different parts of the investigation. To facilitate the possibility of questions, we're going to have two sessions. We're going to have first a 90-minute session in which these staff members of the Warren Commission will talk about their roles, how the Warren Commission was formed, how the staff began, and so on. And during that period of time, you're welcome, if you have questions, to go to the question table over there to the right. We have some cards. You can write your question down and drop it in the basket, and we'll organize it. Then we have a 30-minute break between 2:30 and 3, and the book table is staying open through the break, we've ascertained. And so if you want a book, grab it then, and then we may be able to prevail on Howard Willens to stay and sign a couple of them after the program concludes at 4:30. During the break, we'll collate the questions and organize them, and then a second panel will join us here on the stage of academic experts. Jay Vogelson, a Dallas lawyer who also served on the staff of the Warren Commission, will anchor that second panel, but then we'll be joined by my colleagues from the university, Dennis Simon, Tom Stone, Chris Jenks, and Lachlan Bloom, each of whom is going to take a set of the questions from the audience but have brought questions of their own to pose to the panel, and there'll be general discussion among the two panels. So we'll go from 1 to 2:30, 30-minute break, and then from 3 to 4:30, and the afternoon will conclude. We have an SMU Law School connection to the investigation, as you may know, and that is that Dean Robert Gerald Story, who was the dean of the SMU Law School, and then the president of the Southwestern Legal Foundation, was appointed together with Leon Jaworski to the Court of Inquiry that had been established by State Attorney General Wagner Carr into the assassination. And the Court of Inquiry cooperated with the Warren Commission during the course of their investigation. Also, you'll see in Howard Willens' book that when he came to Dallas in March of 1964, he was advised to meet Barefoot Sanders, who was the United States Attorney for the Northern District of Texas, and Robert Story. And as Willens puts it, Story knew most of the lawyers in Dallas and had asked them for money. So there is a historical connection between the SMU Law School and the Warren Commission work. So now I'd like to invite Jim Hollifield to say a word of welcome on behalf of the Tower Center. Yep.
My name is Jim Hollifield, and I'm a professor here at SMU, and I run a center that was named for the former senator from Texas, John Goodwin Tower. A lot of you in the room may be old enough to remember the senator. This center is a center for political studies, but it is also a center for public and international affairs. Here, the premier center really on the campus of SMU and in Dallas-Fort Worth. And I just want to add a warm word of welcome to all of you who may be coming to the campus today for the first time. You can see what a beautiful campus it is. And I guess there's a little football game, I think, taking place tomorrow, something called the Red River Shootout or something like that. But it is truly a historic moment for us here at SMU to welcome these distinguished jurists who sat on the commission, helped to organize it and staff it. And I just want to say that it's really great to collaborate with the Sixth Floor Museum. I also sit on the board of the Sixth Floor Museum, and to work with the Dedman School of Law on this. This is what a university is all about, bringing something like this to the public square so we can look and think and reflect and commemorate the tragic events that happened almost 50 years ago. So I think now I'm going to turn and welcome to the podium Nicola Longford, who is the Executive Director of the Sixth Floor Museum. And I just want to say what a great institution the Sixth Floor is for Dallas and for the country and really for the world. So many people who come through this museum and remember what happened here years ago. So Nicola, would you please come to the podium? Thank you.
Thank you. Good afternoon. I'm Nicola Longford, the Executive Director of the Sixth Floor Museum at Dealey Plaza. And the Sixth Floor Museum is delighted to continue this innovative program collaboration and partnership with Southern Methodist University, the John Goodwin Tower Center for Political Studies, and the Dedman School of Law. Planning for today's special program and bringing together the staffers of the Warren Commission has been a long time in the making. It's been at least 2 years since the conversations first began. And clearly, without the interest and support of our distinguished panelists, this program would not be taking place. And nor would it be without the incredible support and agility from the staff and faculty at the Dedman School of Law, and also for the committed and super organized staff at the Tower Center. Thank you all, and especially to the colleagues with whom I have the privilege of working at the Sixth Floor Museum. And if I may speak on behalf of all of us, it has been a great pleasure working with our fine colleagues at SMU, but how fitting it is, as we approach the 50th anniversary of the assassination of President Kennedy, the Dallas community is really coming together to reflect and remember this tragic event and put it into meaningful context for generations now and into the future. So thank you all so very much.
Hi, I'm Julie Forrester, and I'm serving as Interim Dean of the SMU Dedman School of Law this year. I'd like to welcome you on behalf of the law school, and I'd like to introduce the moderator of our first panel. The Honorable Sarah R. Saldana is the United States Attorney for the Northern District of Texas. A native of Corpus Christi, she's a summa cum laude graduate of Texas A&I University. She taught school and worked in several U.S. government agencies before attending law school and graduated from the SMU Dedman School of Law in 1984. Upon graduation from law school, she clerked for U.S. District Judge Barefoot Sanders. Judge Sanders, of course, was a former U.S. Attorney for the Northern District of Texas, the position that Sarah now holds. In fact, he held that position in November of 1963. After clerking, Sarah spent nearly 20 years in private practice in Dallas. She joined the U.S. Attorney's Office in 2004. In 2011, she was nominated to become the United States Attorney and is the first Hispanic woman to serve as a U.S. Attorney in Texas. Please welcome Sarah Saldana, who will introduce the members of our first panel.
Good afternoon, everybody. Listen, I am so excited about being here. I consider this a great privilege to participate in this panel. I'm going to be the moderator, but based on a conference call we had earlier this week, or last week, from what I can tell and what these gentlemen have to say, I am going to step back. This is going to be the easiest moderating job I've ever had because there's some fascinating stories and conversation they're going to have with you. One thing I know I did not know, other than I was a sixth grader at the time that the president was killed, I did not know, I did not study at that time about the Warren Commission, but I've come to know quite a bit of it. Some of you may know that I actually, in a adaptation, mock trial of Lee Harvey Oswald a couple of months ago, I prosecuted Mr. Oswald. He was sitting there at defense table right next to me. And Toby Shook, a former first assistant with the Dallas DA's office, was the defense attorney. So I got to learn a lot with the assistance of my super paralegal who's here, Lisa Anderson. I got to learn a lot about the Warren Commission, and I'm so delighted that I've been asked to participate here today. Let me tell you about these panelists. Wow, is what you're going to say when this is all over. Judge Burt Griffin is a graduate of Amherst College and Yale Law School. My husband is a Yalie, too. He's right here on the front row. Class of 67. All right. He served as a law clerk for the District of Columbia Circuit and as an assistant United States attorney. I love those people. Before becoming assistant staff counsel to the Warren Commission. He was then in private law practice before service with Cleveland Legal Aid. He served as a trial judge in Cleveland for 30 years and has been a mediator and arbitrator since 2005. Justice Richard Mosk, a graduate of Stanford University and Harvard Law School, then served in the military before joining the staff of the Warren Commission. After a clerkship on the California Supreme Court, he worked in private practice. He served for 10 years in the 80s and 90s as a judge on the Iran-United States Claims Tribunal, adjudicating the financial claims made as a result of the breakdown in relations between the two countries in 1979. In 2001, he was appointed to the California Court of Appeal. And why we say Court of Appeal, I don't know, but apparently California has this practice, so I am going to honor that. Justice Stuart Pollack, a graduate of Stanford University and Harvard Law School, served as law clerk to Chief Justice Earl Warren in 1962 and 1963. And then in the criminal division of the U.S. Department of Justice with time off to serve on the staff of the Warren Commission. And in fact, all of these folks, I think, had to ask permission and take time off to do this, to perform this service for our country. He returned to California and private practice before serving 20 years as a trial judge in San Francisco, before his appointment to the California Court of Appeal in 2002. Professor W. David Slauson, a graduate of Amherst College, Princeton University, and Harvard Law School. Could you not have done better, Professor? Was with a law firm in Denver and worked on the staff of the Warren Commission. He left private practice to serve in the Office of Legal Counsel in the United States Department of Justice. After 2 years there, Professor Slauson joined the faculty at the University of Southern California Law School, retiring in 2004. He served as general counsel to the Price Commission in 1971 and 1972. Howard P. Willens, a graduate of the University of Michigan and Yale Law, became executive assistant to the Assistant Attorney General for the Criminal Division after military service and private practice. From the Department of Justice, he became assistant counsel to the Warren Commission. He returned to private practice thereafter. As managing director of his law firm, he served as special legal counsel to the governor of the Commonwealth of the Northern Mariana Islands. So if you will join me in welcoming this distinguished panel. Bill, let's take our seats and we'll get started.
Good afternoon. I'd like to thank, on behalf of my colleagues, the Dedman School of Law, the sixth floor museum, and the Tower Center for their support of this event. We are very appreciative of the opportunity to set forth our view of the Warren Commission, who they were, who we were, what we did, why did we do it the way we did, what conclusions did we reach, and how have those conclusions withstood the test of time. Professor Bridge mentioned Dean Story, and he took the story right out of my mouth because, in fact, Dean Story was one of the influential people in the United States who shaped the nation's response to this charismatic event on November 22. As he reported, there was a court of inquiry that was appointed by the Attorney General that was going to undertake an investigation of the assassination and also the events involving Jack Ruby, because with Oswald's death, we were denied the opportunity for a trial in the traditional courts of the United States, would have been in the courts of Texas, on the basis of which the public would have become informed to some extent of who he was, why he did what he did. In the absence of that fact-finding mechanism, President Johnson was willing initially to let the court of inquiry in Texas go forward, as well as the Dallas County investigation, as well as congressional investigations that were being promised or threatened by leaders both in the Senate and the House of Representatives. And so after my boss, the head of the criminal division, came down here to meet with Barefoot Sanders and to meet with some of the representatives of the Texas law enforcement community, President Johnson was faced with the prospect of at least 4 simultaneously run and conflicting investigations of the facts regarding the assassination. And he changed his mind over the opposition of J. Edgar Hoover at the FBI and Abe Fortas, his most trusted advisor within the White House, and shaped the President's Commission on the assassination. Judge, you probably have heard the story about Chief Justice Warren not wanting to serve on this commission. He turned down the offer of chairmanship when he was approached by the then Deputy Attorney General, Nick Katzenbach, and the Solicitor General, Professor Archibald Cox of Harvard. He turned it down because he felt that the past history of the Supreme Court showed that using justices on non-judicial assignments was a divisive and unproductive use of their time and adverse to the interest of the court. However, President Johnson, using his legendary forces of persuasion, called the Chief Justice into his office, made reference to the Chief Justice's service in World War I, and said, what you did then is only a precursor of what you could do now in the service of your country. And the Chief Justice, being that sort of archaic figure in American history, said, yes, Mr. President, I will do my best. President, you may not know also that there was another resistant person to join the commission, and that was Senator Richard Russell of Georgia. It was very important to President Johnson to have representation from Congress, not because they were going to attend all the hearings and have a attendance record of credit, but because they would bring to the task the judgment, experience, and political wisdom that would help produce a report that would be accepted by the American people and indeed of the world. Senator Russell, however, was adamant. He did not like Chief Justice Warren. He did not like the liberal rulings of the Supreme Court. He did not like anything about this commission. And he sat there explaining at some length to the President why he could not serve on this commission. And President Johnson reasoned with him, appealed to their long relationship, appealed to his sense of loyalty to the presidency, and got absolutely nowhere. And the President closed this conversation by telling Senator Russell, I'm sorry, Senator, I've already announced to the press that you're a member. So at that point, the senator had no choice, and he did work with Chief Justice Warren, but let's put it this way, as infrequently as possible. So when the commission got organized. I was sent over there by the Department of Justice. It was the Deputy Attorney General, as we say, volunteered me to do this job. And for those of you who were in the military service, as I was for a few years, knows what one does when the Master Sergeant volunteers you to do an assignment. You say, yes, sir. And so I did, and I worked nonstop on the Commission's work from then to the submission of the report in September of 1964. The Commission decided very early on that it was going to conduct its own investigation. They received summary reports from the FBI, both on the Oswald aspect of the matter and on the Ruby aspect of the matter, and supplemental reports in January of 1964. But after reading the summary reports, the members of the Commission, men of great credentials and experience, decided they could not rely on summary reports, so they took two steps. First, they asked that every agency submitting a report to them in summary form provide the underlying investigative reports. Secondly, after reading the report, they decided there were so many unanswered questions that they really had to set about conducting their own independent investigation of the facts relating to the assassination and Oswald's murder by Ruby. As a result, we presided over the most extensive criminal investigation ever conducted in the United States. The Commission heard the sworn testimony of 94 witnesses. Lawyers from the staff of the Commission conducted 395 depositions, many of them taking place here in Dallas. There were 61 affidavits and 2 written statements, a total of 552 witnesses providing testimony, most of it sworn testimony, on the basis of which the Commission would shape its conclusions and the staff would help write the report. The Chief Justice took an intensely personal view of his role in this matter. If there was a hero to this investigation, it was Chief Justice Warren. There came a time in June when the Chief Justice was worried about the progress of our report and feared, as all members of presidential commissions fear, that the staff was getting out ahead of them. There is a great tradition in presidential commissions of the staff thinking they're superior in knowledge of the facts to the members of the commission, and the members of the commission feeling that their experience and judgment outweigh their deficiency in knowing the facts. So there was this tension in this presidential commission, another one which I happened to work on a year later, and the Chief Justice found a way to deal with this fact. He scheduled a meeting with the General Counsel, Lee Rankin, but Lee Rankin was up in New York that particular day, and so the Chief Justice agreed to meet with me and my very closest colleague, Professor Norman Redlich from NYU Law School, who together with me served as Lee Rankin's sort of unofficial deputies. I hasten to add with my colleagues here, I did not have any special title. They were always free to reject whatever I had to say, and they usually did. And they were always free to go talk to Lee Rankin and when they wanted to do so. But in any event, the Chief Justice showed up at this meeting with Norman and me and Burt Jenner, who was a senior by at least 20 years to both of us, and would provide some senior support, I think Rankin believed. And the Chief Justice arrived with a handwritten piece of paper, familiar to all lawyers, a yellow pad, no less than a yellow pad piece of paper on which he had listed 41 questions on which he wanted his commission members to address and resolve. And he asked us what we thought of his approach after reading off several questions, which were really quite simple and straightforward. How many shots were there? Where'd they come from? Who did it? Who owned the rifle? Where'd he go? And who helped him? And so on for 41 questions. Well, the staff, we of course commended the Chief Justice for his diligent work and bringing to us a mechanism for organizing his commission, which was indeed a useful step to take. And so we took the 41 questions, and with the help of my creative colleagues, we enlarged it to 72 questions, and the commission then sat for at least 2 sessions and periodically for the next few months reviewing these questions and making their decisions as to each of them. There were some that they reserved for their final meeting on September 18, 1964, a few days before the printer needed all the segments of the report. But it was a process that proved most useful, and I spend some time in my book explaining the process and using the notes that Lee Rankin made as the commission addressed these questions and either reached a decision, decided to defer a decision, gave instructions to the staff as to how better to organize the material. But having made the decision, they gave the staff the opportunity to organize the material, bolster the arguments, assess credibility for further review by the commission. So I think the claims that we were dependent on federal agencies in the investigation are completely without support. This was an independent investigation that used the investigative agencies to produce useful information, but that provided a starting point for the kind of exploration and development of sworn testimony that I have referred to. I also feel that comments about ulterior forces working on the members of the commission to produce a preordained conclusion of no conspiracy is absolutely without support as well. The 7 members of the commission were not going to endanger their decades of reputation in public service by doing anything less than conducting the fullest investigation they could outline and manage and respond to. And so far as the staff was concerned, I think one has to remember that virtually all members of the staff, and indeed all the assistant counsel except for myself, came from outside the government. The Chief Justice wanted people from the private sector who would come to this investigation without any loyalty to the state of Texas, the city of Dallas, or loyalty to any federal agency. They wanted people who would be free to call a conspiracy if in fact the evidence so indicated. So I think that the independence and integrity of the commission and staff was there for everyone to observe, and I think that there's nothing that people have said in later years that, in my view, cast any fair doubt on the work of the commission. Were the members infallible? No. Were the members of the staff infallible? Well, I think the answer is no there as well. But the point is that everyone collaborated to produce a report that we think has withstood the test of time. One of our first problems, of course, was to address the situation with respect to Lee Harvey Oswald, who was, of course, the only suspect at the time. And the FBI had already provided information to the commission as to where the shots came from, how many bullets were fired, what witnesses had seen a rifle protruding from the window on the 6th floor. And so addressing the culpability of Lee Harvey Oswald was a major first assignment of the commission, and indeed much of the first 2 months, once the staff got organized during February and March, was addressed to developing the information with respect to the wounds suffered by President Kennedy and Governor Connolly, the source of the shots, and the medical testimony, ballistics testimony, all of which related to issues affecting the identification of the culprit. Our very first witness was his wife, Marina Oswald. The press was getting very anxious as to the work of this commission. They'd been in existence for 2 months, and so far as the press knew, they'd done absolutely nothing. So the reporters congregated outside our office near the Supreme Court on the morning of February 3, 1964, when Marina Oswald was going to appear. When the Chief Justice approached the group of reporters, they were eager to ask questions. And the first question that came out of their mouth was, "Mr. Chief Justice, when will we hear about her testimony?" And the Chief Justice said, "Yes, you may hear, but perhaps not in your lifetime." And then he went on to try to explain that he meant that certain materials would be withheld because of national security interest. However, the explanation of what he said, which was hurriedly put out by the Chief Justice and Lee Rankin, never caught up with the tagline, "Not in your lifetime." And indeed, 3 months later in Europe, where there was almost a unanimous view there had to be a conspiracy, one of the 3 reasons listed for that belief was Chief Warren's "not in your lifetime" comment. So what did the commission want to hear from Marina Oswald? Well, what would you have wanted to hear if you had Marina Oswald before you under such circumstances? You'd want to know, well, was she an agent? Was he an agent? What did she know about his plan to kill the president? What kind of man was he? What was his motive? These were the questions that the commission wanted to explore with the widow, and they did so in 3 separate sessions with her over the next several months, and she was also deposed by one of our colleagues during that period of time. There was a lot of debate within the staff as to whether the interrogation of Marina Oswald had been sufficiently rigorous. Everyone would conduct interrogation of this kind, I think, in a different manner. But I think after 3 separate sessions and the 4th deposition, that I think the staff generally was of the view that the commission had gotten from Marina Oswald all that one could get, and that basically she had no knowledge of her husband's intentions, and she had considerable difficulty herself in figuring out her husband. At one point she was asked, well, was he a good husband or a bad husband? And she responded, well, he's a good husband when he helps with the dishes and helps with the children, and he's a bad husband when he beats me. Now, that sounds have a certain plausibility. And then when she was asked, well, what would make him happy? Where would he ever be satisfied? She said, well, he wasn't happy in the United States, so he went to Russia. He wasn't happy there in the Soviet Union, so he came back. He probably wouldn't be happy in Cuba if he ever had gotten to Cuba. He might only be happy on the moon. So I think the commission learned, and this evidence about his character was explored at more length. We listed in the report many factors that might have influenced his action, but we could not settle, and no one really tried to settle on exactly which of the 6 or 7 factors might have been the predominant one that caused him to cross this step and shoot the president. We did learn from Marina Oswald and from the evidence that had been accumulated before the commission started operating that she had previously lied to the investigative agencies about 2 things. First, she had denied knowing anything about his trip to Mexico, where he was looking for a visa to go to Cuba, perhaps on his way to the Soviet Union. And she had lied about his attempt to assassinate General Edwin Walker here in Dallas. But Lee Oswald had left a note for her about his intention to shoot General Walker in April. He had a picture of himself, and what became clear as we continued this investigation was that Oswald, by himself, had planned to go out and assassinate General Walker. He had researched the bus routes to find out how he would get to and from General Walker's home. He found places along the railroad where he could bury the rifle before and after the attempt. He had no escape plan whatsoever. He fully expected to be either killed or apprehended as a result of this attempt, and left a note for his wife and telling her what bills had been paid and what money was available for her to pay further bills, instructed her to go to the Soviet Union and she could get relief from the Red Cross. He even told her that if he was apprehended, he identified the location of the jail in which he would be held. So he had no plan for escape, and he wanted her to maintain the records of his pictures and his property, because he felt this was a historic event and he wanted to be remembered for it. And there was no evidence at all, at any step along the way, that Oswald was aided by any person in his attempt on General Walker. Now, that does not prove that he did act alone with respect to President Kennedy, but it does reveal a character and a mode of operation and an emotional capacity to kill another human being, which was validated cruelly when he shot Patrolman Tippit with 4 shots into the chest at short range, that this capacity to kill another person was there, and obviously was proven even further with the assassination of President Kennedy. The medical testimony was extremely important because there was 1 whole bullet and 2 fragments of a bullet that were subject to identification in the presidential limousine. All those bullets and fragments were proven to have come from the rifle on the 6th floor that was owned by Lee Harvey Oswald. But there was some confusion because of the initial report in the FBI report that 1 bullet had hit the president in the back and exited in his back. A 2nd bullet had hit Connolly, and a 3rd bullet was the fatal shot that hit the president in the head. And although those facts were corrected through the medical testimony within 24 hours, the FBI persisted in maintaining that there were 3 bullets of the nature that I've just outlined. And the staff, with the help of Secret Service and FBI agents, looked at the film, the famous Zapruder film, trying to figure out exactly when each shot occurred, what the reactions were of either Governor Connolly or the president, and to try to provide a sequence that would be consistent with the medical testimony and with the ballistics evidence. And it just didn't ring true. And it was in the course of one of these sessions where the group examining it, including Professor Redlich, Ireland Spector, Mel Eisenberg, David Bellin, and Joe Ball, 5 of our colleagues, only one of whom is alive today, concluded that, it was probably the case that once we learned that there was a wound in the president's throat that had been used at Parkland Hospital and enlarged in order to enable the president to recover, if that was possible, it was an exit wound, and the question was, where did the bullet go that exited the president's throat? And of course, soon this group developed the idea, of course, it had to hit either the car or somebody else in the car, because it was on a downward trajectory, and it was not going to escape out of the car. And there was no further damage in the car, and Connolly was situated in a position in the car where he would be the recipient of the bullet after it exited the president's throat. The medical testimony and the expert testimony of wounds experts from the U.S. Army demonstrated that, in fact, the wound suffered by Governor Connolly would have been more drastic and severe if, in fact, it had not already traversed the president's body. Nonetheless, Governor Connolly insisted throughout the investigation that he was not hit by the same bullet that hit the president. He was hit by a separate bullet. So the single bullet theory, of course, has gone through the ages as a much maligned shorthand for the commission's conclusion, which, of course, it became a conclusion of fact, not a theory, because after a reenactment in Dallas in May of 1964, it seemed very evident that the bodies of the president and the governor were positioned in the car in such a way that the bullet, after it exited from the president, would hit the Connolly and cause the nature of the wounds in his back, his wrist, and his thigh that he suffered. So it was, and furthermore, what people tend to forget is that the pathologist and the commission were not the only people that reached this view, that this particular conclusion was reviewed by experts in 1968, experts in 1975, experts in 1976, and again in 1978. And out of 20 experts, 20, I guess to be precise, 21 pathologists, experts in such matters, who examined the autopsy photographs and x-rays, they all concluded in the course of the bullet, and 20 out of 21 concluded, as did the commission, that a single bullet created the back throat wounds of the president and the wounds suffered by Governor Connolly. The dissenting pathologist, who will be in town 2 weeks from now, featured at a conference, when asked what happened to the bullet when it exited the president's throat, he said, "I don't know. I didn't conduct the investigation." And unless one has a rational explanation that can rival in terms of consistent with the law of physics and with the physical evidence available, I think there's not a rational discussion that can be had on the question of the single bullet, a conclusion. We did have the problem, as you know, of dealing with conspiracy, and the problem that you'll hear about more from my colleagues, but the overwhelming problem from the outset was that it is always impossible analytically to prove a negative. And here the task was to prove there was no conspiracy. Now, the commission was aware then of all the possible interest here in Texas and nationally and internationally who might have an interest in assassinating the president. But in order to prove a conspiracy, you have to prove there's some relationship between the alleged conspirators and the people who actually did the deed, whether it's Lee Harvey Oswald or Jack Ruby. And the commission staff and the members of the commission conducted a widespread investigation looking at the associations of both these individuals intensely and comprehensively, and could not find any evidence that either of them had been aided in any way by one of the alleged suspects. And so that, of course, is a conclusion that one can never be absolutely certain about, and what the commission did in its findings was to say, we have found no credible evidence of a conspiracy. They did not say there was no conspiracy. And they fully understood that with the decades to come, there might be additional evidence that would persuade impartial, knowledgeable people that there was a conspiracy. It's been 49 years, and that evidence still has not materialized. And if I had had the courage of my convictions, the book would be entitled, History Has Proved Us Right, rather than History Will Prove Us Right. The last point I want to just mention is the question that was an important one to the commission, and that is, did the intelligence agencies of the United States fail their obligations to the president by not bringing Lee Harvey Oswald forward as a possible suspect in advance of the motorcade? Suspect is probably too strong. The criteria that the Secret Service followed in those days was that agencies were asked to inform it in advance of any presidential visit. Are there any people in the neighborhood who have demonstrated either some kind of animus against the president, have some capacity for violence, are located in some fortuitous location that might permit them to threaten or assault the president? And the agencies were sort of left to themselves as to how to comply with these fairly amorphous criteria. So Director Hoover showed up to testify before the commission, and when asked specifically what the obligations of the FBI were, he said, we had no responsibility whatsoever to report Oswald's name to the Secret Service. And the members of the commission were really quite vigorous in examining the director on this point, because a lot of information was available in early November of 1963 with respect to Lee Harvey Oswald. In fact, the agent handling the matter, James Hosty, had already interviewed Marina Oswald. He'd visited the place where Marina Oswald lived in the home of Ruth Paine, and he knew where Lee Harvey Oswald worked, but he had not made any arrangements to interview Oswald. So the director said that there was nothing in the previous 3 interviews that justified reporting Oswald to the Secret Service, even though, as he was well aware, Oswald had gone to Mexico to visit the Cuban and the Soviet embassies, and he'd written recently to the Soviet embassy in Washington, D.C. So the members of the commission felt that the FBI should have done more, and in fact, in the report, they said, well, maybe the technical criteria didn't apply, but the FBI really had not performed this investigation as thoroughly as we might have wished. And what Hoover did not tell the commission was that immediately after the assassination, he ordered that an investigation be made within the Bureau to see whether, in fact, his agents and officials had acted in a sufficiently responsive and comprehensive way with respect to Lee Harvey Oswald and his wife. And he got a recommendation in December, which he implemented, which was to discipline 17 officials and agents of the FBI because he concluded that they had failed to pursue the Oswald investigation with the thoroughness that he anticipated from his agents. That fact remained secret for more than a decade, until 1975, when his deception to the commission was made clear. And what the director did not know was that there was another piece of evidence that bore on the question whether or not the FBI should refer the name to the Secret Service. And that was that in November, after Agent Hosty had interviewed Marina Oswald, his office received a note in an unsealed envelope addressed to Agent Hosty, and the receptionist, a curious woman, not surprisingly, opened the envelope And the testimony differs as to what was in the envelope, because this particular note was destroyed by Hosty at the direction of the chief of the FBI office in Dallas on Sunday after Oswald was shot by Ruby. According to the receptionist, the note said something along this line: "This is a warning. I will burn the FBI office and police headquarters if you don't stop bothering my wife. Signed, Lee Harvey Oswald." Agent Hosty remembers something that went like this: "I understand you're trying to acquire information about me. I would appreciate your contacting me directly. If you continue interviewing my wife, I will report your conduct to the appropriate authorities." Unsigned. Now, one had to make a judgment about which of these two versions of this note rings more true. And the point is that the note was there, and it was destroyed, and when you put together all the information that the FBI had about Lee Harvey Oswald, I leave you with these two questions. Do you think Agent Hosty should have interviewed Oswald before November 22? And if so, do you think the assassination of President Kennedy would have been avoided? Thank you.
Thank you. And as Professor Slauson makes his way, are you going to be speaking from there? If you will just give me 1 second. A couple of things about this from a modern point of view, 50 years later, working with all three of those agencies, the FBI, the Secret Service, and the State Department, it's hard to imagine, especially after September 11th, that people would not share information. If that's anything that gets those agency's attention, is coming across information that it might be material to another agency in its investigations. And I think things were very technical then. This is my lane, and I will stay in it, and this is your lane, and you may stay in it. It's hard to imagine, it could happen, I suppose, that would happen again. And then secondly, I don't know how many of you all have visited the LBJ Library in Austin, but several of those phone calls between Senator Russell and President Johnson are on there, and it is just fascinating to hear. How did you put it? The persuasive tactics, and watch your ears, because there's a little bit of a salty language involved as well. Professor Slauson.
Okay, thank you. Okay, well, my job was the conspiracy angle. And first, just a very brief note on how I was recruited and the man who worked with me. Howard called me up while I was working in my office as a lawyer in Denver and asked me if I wanted to join them. And I had just recently read in the New York Times about it, and of course I was greatly thrilled. But I said, "How did you find me?" And he said, well, he knew very well a good friend of mine from the Harvard Law Review that we had worked together there, named Tom Ehrlich. And he had called Tom first, and Tom was just accepted a job with George Ball. And so he said no, and then Howard asked him, who would you recommend? And he named two people. I was one of them, and I got the job. It was one of the best things that ever happened to me, I think. The other is that my senior lawyer, we were all junior lawyers, and we had a senior lawyer, each one of us working with us. Mine was William T. Coleman, Jr., a very prominent lawyer from Philadelphia, and Bill had worked with Thurgood Marshall before the Brown versus Board of Education decision. He worked with him in the South with the NAACP to try to win cases and do other things to protect the blacks down there. And of course, they eventually did, working together. Thurgood, of course, was the leader, win the case in the United States Supreme Court. So Bill was a great guy. He still is. He's alive and unfortunately a little too old to attend here. But I do want to give credit to him because all the important decisions we made together. Okay. When I came to the commission, as Howard has correctly said, we didn't know anything about the kind of things we were going to be doing, except that we were lawyers, and we certainly were familiar with making investigations of that sort, or of some sort. The first thing, the CIA representative gave me the materials they had and talked to me about the ways that the KGB, the Russian security apparatus, would assassinate people. That all they knew at that time. And to put it down in a nutshell, they did it in a way, as far as the CIA could determine, that would not leave a trace of their guilt in it. And they would do it secretly so that you wouldn't even know the person had not died of natural causes. One case I remember, a man was killed with a bullet, a rifle kind of a mechanism in an umbrella, rolled up an umbrella, and someplace in Europe with a chemical that would cause him to die just with the same symptoms of a heart attack. Now, a good autopsy could have detected the difference, but who would think of a good autopsy in those circumstances? There was no record of them having used someone like Lee Harvey Oswald, which didn't, of course, rule out that they had not used him in this case, but at least it was a beginning, something that I should understand before Bill and I went into it. All right. And then the rest of it, I'm going to outline how he did it, but the first thing I want to say about all that is the outline, it'll sound fairly orderly. It was not the facts. All these things came into me helter-skelter. And the biggest part of my job for the first few months was simply organizing all this and trying to see the connections between all the information that came in. And of course, this was the days before computers, so it was all right, and then talk to a secretary, get it typed down, make a file, put it someplace, and try not to forget where it was. But anyway, I did pull it all together. Bill's job was, as he saw it, mostly coming in after I had put it all together, and then we made the decisions together on it, very much so. First thing in the logical order was Russia. Oswald had decided, we found this out, I'll back up a minute, after he died, we discovered among his effects, what they called his historic diary. It purported to be a diary of basically his adult life. I mean, it isn't that long, but it's fairly detailed. Marina had never seen it. He kept this secret from everybody else in the world, as far as we know. And in it, he related all these things. Well, the first thing is this his diary really, or is this part of the whole legend that they created about him? We didn't even know that. But at least it was a starting point. And then later, as we got on, we were able to authenticate virtually everything, not quite everything, but almost everything in it that he recorded. So we were able to finally to conclude, yes, this was written by Lee Harvey Oswald, and what it relates, although of course it made him sound like a big hero, basically was the truth. It recorded that he had made up his mind while he was in the Marine Corps during the last few months that he would, when he got out, defect to Russia. And he would tell them, among other things, the secrets he had learned in the Marine Corps. Well, I was a private in the Army for a couple of years, and you don't learn many secrets at that level. Anyway, among other things, it recorded that when he did go into Russia, or rather went into, Russia, Moscow, trying to seek entry on some kind of permanent basis, that he was first turned down, and this was after weeks and weeks of waiting around on tenterhooks and being examined and interviewed over and over again. Then they said no, and they not only said no, they ordered him out of the country within hours, as if to say, get out of here. He then committed suicide, or he tried to. He slit his wrist. He was found covered with blood, unconscious, in his bathtub in his hotel by the KGB agent, who he thought was just an interest guide, but pretty clearly was a KGB agent, who was in charge of him because he failed to show up an appointment for her, and she went looking for him, and she found him unconscious in the way I described. And so they took him to the hospital, they saved his life, and I've forgotten the time scale exactly, but say, something like a month later, perhaps a little bit less, he finally was allowed in. Now, we don't know why they changed his mind. The Russians changed their mind. But the most convincing reason we heard, again, you don't know what this was the KGB had originally decided this guy, and we learned this from Nosenko, who came over while we were doing the investigation. He was a Russian KGB officer himself who allegedly defected, but the CIA were evaluating him at the time that we got this information from him. And so we couldn't really know whether it was true or not. And then, although Nosenko was eventually evaluated as genuine, I personally don't know. I mean, anyway, this is what he said. They decided, the KGB decided, that Oswald was too highly neurotic, this is the exact words if I remember, highly neurotic and unstable, and would be of no use to them. Now, that didn't mean that they were planning an assassination. It just meant that they might have thought they could use him as a spy by sending him back, or maybe just as a propaganda tool or something. But anyway, they didn't want to use him for anything. But according to Nosenko again, some other agency of the Soviet Union decided to let him in. Now, why did they do that? It might have been for propaganda purposes, because here was a man who so desperately wanted to come to Russia that he tried to commit suicide when he couldn't do it. We'll let him in, we'll treat him very well, he'll love Russia, and he'll be a great propaganda voice from that point on. That's just speculation. Once when Alan Dulles, who is the ex-CIA director and also one of our commissioners, he would occasionally come in and talk to me about his days in the CIA and what he knew and remembered about Russia. Nothing secret particularly, in fact, nothing secret at all from Mr. Dulles. He speculated, he said, I can't remember her name, but there was the highest woman in the Kremlin was Madame Tsartseva or something like that. He says, you know, she had sympathy for cases like this. She might have said, let the poor guy in. Well, anyway, he was allowed in. So all this is prefaced to, we had to study everything we could about his entry into Russia, his being let out of the Marine Corps, where he was stationed in the Marine Corps, and his life in Russia with Marina, and his coming out again, which was a difficult process. Could he bring his wife, who was a Russian national after all? Could he himself, well, he could have come out pretty easily as far as the Russians were concerned, but he had tried to renounce his American citizenship when he went into Russia. So should our State Department first have allowed him to do so, because they staved him off, says, think about it, in fact. And they made up excuses why he couldn't do it right away. So they had to allow him back into the United States. And so anyway, we studied all this as best we could to see if there was anything sinister about it, anything that might show the imprint of Russians' attempt to use him in some manner if he came back to the United States. And the final decision was negative, but in doing that, we used the CIA and the State Department to tell us as much as they could about the circumstances of of Oswald's activities in Russia. For example, he was living in Minsk, which was quite a ways from Moscow, and when he started to try to get out, he had to go to Moscow to talk to both the Soviet officials and the State Department officials. And he was not supposed to travel without the KGB's permission, not leave Minsk. But he did on 2 or 3 occasions. And they caught him on every occasion. Well, why didn't he end up in prison or something like that? Both the State Department and the CIA had information on some information on how these kind of people were treated that way. And like all legal systems, the Russians they enforced some laws and they didn't enforce others. This one, all they did to these guys, not just Oswald, but the other ones who were there under similar circumstances, was in effect ball them out. One man had spent a week in jail after doing it. So again, the decision on that was nothing mysterious. Oswald was paid very well, more than anybody he knew, for the essentially easy work he did. But that turns out that's also typical. The Soviet government knew darn well that no one was going to be happy in Russia that had ever lived in the United States or another country that had a decent economy with the kind of wages that the workers earned there. So he earned probably about 3 times as much as his colleagues or his friends would have made. But that's just the way defectors were treated. Despite that, he wasn't happy, was not satisfied. Another detail which I think gives an insight into his character at this time, he proposed not to Marina, but to a woman named Ella, that he met at work. And she turned him down. And then he married, this is in his historic diary, I married Marina to get even with Ella. I did not love Marina. But, then he wanted to say, but I learned to love her. And I think he was sincere in that. I won't go any further in that because I'm running out of time. But the next thing that I talk about quickly is the Cuban and the anti-Castro Cubans. The latter were suspected by us of a possible conspiracy because they hated Kennedy because of the Bay of Pigs. They felt betrayed there. He had pulled out our backing of the Bay of Pigs when it became apparent very quickly that the CIA had botched the system, botched the whole planning. The landing was a disaster. Everything was wrong. So he pulled the men out, or tried to. Many of them were captured and killed. But the anti-Castro Cubans hated Kennedy for that. And so our theory was if they could blame it on Oswald, they might trigger a second invasion. And this time, of course, it would work. It would succeed. All right. This is where the CIA and the FBI, but especially the CIA, really got into the secret stuff. And some of that, a very little bit of it, is still secret today. None of the stuff I learned secretly then through their spies and other things contradicted what we came out with, which was the conclusion they were not responsible in any way. But it was, and none of it was crucial either. It was just simply supportive of the other evidence we had. But when Bill and I went to Mexico City, for example, we spent a couple hours in one of these rooms I'd only read about in detective or espionage stories before that, where you're down in the basement and it's all soundproof, and they turn on a radio so that anybody who has penetrated it can't understand what's going on. And so we had this damn radio going on all the time. We were being told about all this. And one of the points, though, and this is been public knowledge now for years and years. After reading the transcripts of some of the wiretaps that where Oswald was talking to people in the Soviet embassy and the Cuban embassy different times, they asked us, would you like to hear the actual wiretaps so you can compare them to the transcripts we have provided? And Bill and I briefly talked about it, and he said, well, there's no sense both of us doing that. One of us should, and the other can do the other things we want to do here. Well, Bill, who says, as an old trial lawyer, he wasn't an old trial lawyer then, but anyway, he was a trial lawyer. I'll read this, I'll listen to the tapes, and Dave, you go talk to the FBI. I had things I had to talk to the FBI about, I had suggestions how they should carry on their investigation, which has been very good, but I thought too narrow in scope, but I won't go into that. Anyway, we were offered the opportunity to hear those tapes. It later transpired those tapes had disappeared, and the CIA said, oh, we just destroyed them after we listened to them in the routine. They didn't exist at the time of the Warren Commission. Well, they did. That's all there is to it. They did. Bill listened to them. I was offered a chance to look at them. Okay, I won't. I've run out of my time. Just end it with a couple points. We were helped by information, even information that was given voluntarily by the Cuban and the Russian governments, because we were able to authenticate it. And we knew that they would know ahead of time that we could, or maybe could, authenticate it, so they didn't want to lie and then be caught in a lie, which really would implicate them. And one of the things that we did get, we got Oswald's medical records, or what purported to be anyway, in the Botkinskaya Hospital where he was treated for his attempted suicide. We also found on the autopsy that he had slit his wrist. And we also finally got Marina's testimony. She said, yes, I was curious about that scar. I asked Lee, but he always evaded answering me. And the other thing is, with the help of Jim Liebler, who has died some years ago, not here, he handled the investigation of Oswald himself, and we learned, we concluded, I should say, he was not the kind of person at all that anyone who was planning to kill the president would have used as a tool for doing it. He was simply not reliable in any kind of way. Okay.
Thank you. Judge Griffin is next. If I can make just one comment about Marina Oswald, one of the things I found out in reading your report, was she had some powerful things to say that if we had tried Oswald, would have been extraordinarily useful. The fact that she said, you all asked, or someone asked squarely, do you believe your husband shot the president? And she took a breath and said, I do. But the evidence that she could have provided with respect to the rifle in the garage and all of these other things would have been dynamite. And of course, one of the things we struggled with was, as you all, somebody said earlier, I think you, Bill, that the trial would have been in state court, and at that time there was a marital privilege, which can be waived now, but at that time there was a marital privilege, and her testimony would probably not have been allowed, even though it was such dynamite.
Can I just briefly we staff, and this was not my job, this was others people to interrogate her, but there was some discussion of, was the Chief Justice too kind to her? Should he have been rougher? And I think the answer is he was right, because she grew to trust him. And therefore, that's why she gave us that kind of honest, I think, sincere information that you just mentioned.
Okay, thank you. Judge Griffin?
Okay, thank you. This may be kind of a seventh inning stretch. If any of you would like to stand up for a minute, or go to, my wife would probably like to stand and go for a walk. Would you like to do that, Bunny? She's got a bad whack. Or if you think you got to go to the bathroom, please feel free to do that. I know it's I know it's tough to sit here in chairs like this for a while. And while you're standing, let me ask a couple of questions. How many of you think that Lee Harvey Oswald did not shoot President Kennedy? Okay. How many of you think that Jack Ruby was involved in a conspiracy to assassinate President Kennedy? Maybe I should leave then. Maybe there's no point. All right. Okay. We're going to talk a little bit about those things. And I'd also, however, like to say that I've just finished reading most of my colleague Howard Willens' book, which is out there. And let me tell you, this is a terrific book. And if you like detective stories, it reads like a detective story, except it is the insider's history of what happened and how we did our work. And I just think it's superb. And I think, will you autograph their copies?
Yes.
Okay. All right. So I really urge you at the break to take advantage of that. Now, who am I and how did I get this job? I was at that point a 31-year-old lawyer in Cleveland, and I had met a guy at a cocktail party in Cleveland that I got to know reasonably well, who then left Cleveland and went to work in Robert Kennedy's office. And my wife and I took him off our Christmas card list, because I figured we'd never hear from Dave Filveroff again. But it turned out I got a call from Dave Filveroff in early January, and he asked me if I'd be interested in working for the Warren Commission to investigate the assassination of President Kennedy. Well, I called my wife, and she was ready to pack her bags and come to Washington. And then I got a call from, I think it was from Howard, actually offering me the job. And at that point, I figured I had to tell some of I was in a small 7-man law firm, so some of the partners in this law firm, I was an associate, that I was going to take this job and go to Washington. And I remember so vividly one of them who said to me, he said, "Bert, these government jobs aren't all they're cracked up to be." He said, I was with the OPA during the Second World War. That was the Office of Price Administration. It was a pretty dull job. Well, somehow I didn't quite agree with him on this and decided to come to Washington. What was my attitude at this point? Well, let me tell you this. I had some political visions in my life, and frankly, as I look back on it now, I know what my thought would have been, which is if I could have found that there was a conspiracy here, I'd have been the senator from Ohio and not John Glenn. So, make no mistake that I wanted to find a conspiracy. And let me also say that I had spent 2 years as an assistant United States attorney. I'd worked with the FBI, and I didn't have the highest regard for the FBI. I thought the people I'd worked with were a pretty bureaucratic, ordinary bunch of people. And when I began to read all of these investigatory reports that Howard was sending to me, I thought these guys have really messed up our opportunity to find a conspiracy here. Because their approach in those days, and I don't know if it's this way now, but as soon as they would get an idea that somebody might be involved in something, they would go out and interview them right away. And it seems to me the last thing you want to tell somebody who might be a conspirator is that, hey, you got his number, and what'd you do that night? And the word goes out. So I did not have a high regard either when I came to the work with the commission or when I saw what they were doing. I did not think these guys were going to help us very much in finding a conspiracy. And I think the one that really convinced me of this was an interview that I read. Why it came across my desk, I don't know, but David, this guy was Charlie Nail, who was a classmate of yours and mine. David was ahead of me at Amherst, a classmate from Amherst, whom I had known, it's a small college, I'd known this guy pretty well. And Charlie Nail lived in Mansfield, Ohio, and he hated he was an ardent Republican. He hated President Kennedy. And apparently, the night or so after the president was assassinated, Charlie, didn't surprise me, was in a bar, and he was talking to his friends, and he said something to the effect of, boy, I'm glad they got that son of a bitch. So the FBI went out and interviewed this guy as a possible suspect in a conspiracy investigation. It was entertaining to read Charlie's interview, but it was ridiculous. And so I realized that we had a problem. And the way Leon Hubert and I decided to approach this problem was that we decided that was Jack Ruby, our question was, is Jack Ruby involved with somebody else either to assassinate President Kennedy, or was he involved in an effort in a conspiracy to kill Lee Harvey Oswald? And so, in addition to trying to find everybody who might have had any particular contact with Ruby and interview them, we decided that we would try to get all the telephone records of Jack Ruby and any telephone that he might have had contact with and any telephone that any of his closer friends or business associates might have had. And in those days, wasn't quite as easy, but also they weren't as comprehensive as they are now, so that we couldn't find out anything about local calls, but we could get records of all the long-distance calls of Jack Ruby and anybody that we thought he might be associated with. And in those days also, long distance was a little closer. In other words, if you lived in downtown Dallas and you had to call Irving, Texas or something like that, that was a long distance call. So we had those records. And we set out to determine where Jack Ruby was on every day from the date that we thought that a conspiracy might have first been conceived. And that was September 26th, which was the date that he left to go to Mexico City. And thinking that if he was going to try to get into Cuba, then that idea might have materialized on the 26th of December or September, I'm sorry. And so we were able to identify where Jack Ruby was on every day from September 26th until he shot Lee Harvey Oswald, except for 5. But we were able to come to the conclusion that we knew he was in Dallas on all those days, other days, and on the 5 that we couldn't get, we had no evidence that he was anyplace else. So that was our approach to a chronology on who was this guy Ruby and what was he doing during this period. When we got to November 22nd, we were able to place Ruby almost on a minute-by-minute basis many of those times. And when we couldn't, we at least were on an hour-by-hour basis. We knew where he was and what he was doing. And Ruby wasn't trying to hide. It's everybody I don't see a lot of people here who weren't alive at the time. For those of you who weren't alive at the time that all this occurred, Jack Ruby was 52 years old. He ran a striptease joint in Dallas. He had 2. He and his sister Eva Grant ran 2 striptease clubs, and he knew a lot of people in town. And particularly if you run a striptease club in those days, you ought to know police officers in order to stay in business. So he knew a lot of police officers, and he gave them free admission and stuff like that. In fact, one of his police officers was engaged to, the police department didn't know this, but one of his police officers one of the Dallas police officers was engaged to one of Ruby's strippers. So yes, Ruby knew people, and I said to Bill Bridge, I think I sent you this email, does that make him a part of the mob? Well, let me tell you that when I was in Cub Scouts, when I was in the 4th, 5th, and 6th grades, our den father was a guy called Big Al of the Prohibition days, Polizzi. And he was one of the best den fathers. He was the best den father. In fact, he was the only one we had until they sent him to the penitentiary. And he was a terrific guy. Now, does that give me mob connections and so forth? I hope you'll not prosecute me. So who is this guy, Jack Ruby? I don't know what Mr. Rose, we have one of the members of the, I don't know if you all know this, but we have juror number 10 from the Ruby trial who was here. Do you want to stand up and let everybody? So, Mr. Rose, I don't know how much of what I know about Jack Ruby went to the Ruby trial, because Ruby never testified at his trial. And his defense was not guilty by reason of insanity. And Mr. Rose, quite understandably, and his fellow jurors didn't buy that not insanity defense. But Ruby did testify before the Warren Commission after the trial. And he wanted to tell his story. We wanted him to testify, but he wanted to come and tell his story. In fact, he even asked for a polygraph test, which was given to him, and he passed the polygraph test. And incidentally, Mr. Rose, the primary premeditation witness in that trial against Ruby, also took a polygraph test. So what a lot of people don't know is he didn't pass the polygraph test. And Ruby's conviction was reversed because of certain improprieties in the testimony of that one particular witness. Okay, so what did Ruby testify to? Chief Justice Warren took his testimony. I want to read some of it to you. Here's what he said. Sunday morning, I saw a letter to little Caroline, 2 columns, about a 16-inch area. Someone had written a letter to Caroline, the most heartbreaking letter. Alongside that letter was a small comment in the newspaper that Mrs. Kennedy may have to come back for the trial of Lee Harvey Oswald. I don't know what bug got a hold of me. I don't know what it is, but I'm going to tell the truth word for word. I am taking a pill called Preludin. I use it for dieting. I think it was a stimulus to give me an emotional feeling that suddenly I felt, which was so stupid, that I wanted to show my love for our faith, being of the Jewish faith. Suddenly the emotional feeling came within me that someone owed this debt to our beloved president to save her the ordeal of coming back. I don't know why that came through my mind. What I want to point out from that is that Ruby said that his Jewish faith is what was part of his reason for shooting Lee Harvey Oswald. And doesn't that sound like the most bizarre kind of thing? But it's not so bizarre. And let me tell you why. On the morning of November 22nd, which is the day that the president was shot, the Dallas Morning News carried a full-page, black-bordered advertisement, critical in a subtle way of President Kennedy. And it was signed with the name Bernard Weissman, which Ruby identified as a Jewish name. And Ruby thought that nobody who was Jewish could have been a part of an ad like that. And Ruby expressed this feeling to people. He was at the moment that the president was shot, Ruby was at the advertising office of the Dallas Morning News. And he expressed criticism to the Dallas Morning News for publishing that full-page advertisement. And Ruby got the idea that somehow the assassination of President Kennedy was going to be part of an effort to blame the Jews. And he became, if I can put it this way, the first private conspiracy investigator, because he set out to find out who was this guy Bernard Weissman, whose name was on the bottom of the ad. And he looked in the telephone directory. He couldn't find Weissman's name in the telephone directory. And so the Jewish community in those days in Dallas wasn't that big. And as it is in most communities, people know each other in the Jewish community. And he didn't know this guy Weissman. He went to services, it was Friday night, he went to services, he asked his rabbi if he'd ever heard of Weissman. The rabbi had never heard of Weissman. So he became convinced that this assassination was going to be blamed on the Jews. So then he begins to really start his search. And to do this, having been an experienced striptease club operator, he knew the way to get information was to make friends with people. So he goes out and buys 10 corned beef sandwiches to take to the Dallas police station. And he takes these corned beef sandwiches to the Dallas police station, and by the time he got there, which was quite a bit after dinner time, these guys had all eaten. So he has these 10 corned beef sandwiches. But he decides to stick around, and he tells people he's an interpreter for the Israeli press. And in fact, when there's a press conference held at midnight that night, in which Henry Wade and Chief Curry bring out Lee Oswald, there's a picture of Ruby right there, with a pad of paper, and in those days they didn't have computers, so he's there with his pad of paper taking these notes, and he had a pistol in his pocket at that time. Well, his next thing, which I'm going to share with you here, is that he somehow decides that there's a billboard on one of the Dallas streets, freeways, big Impeach Earl Warren billboard. Some of you may remember those. And so he goes out, he wakes at about 3 o'clock in the morning, he wakes his roommate, a guy by the name of George Senator, gets him to come out because he wants to go out and take a photograph of this billboard. He then goes down to his nightclub, the Carousel Club. He gets this guy who's taking care of his dogs. Ruby was a great dog lover. He owned 7 dogs. And they go out to take a picture at about 4:30 in the morning of this Impeach Earl Warren billboard, because he thinks that's somehow connected with the Weissman ad and the assassination. And then he notes the post office box that's on this billboard. Then he goes with George Senator and Larry Crayford to the Dallas post office and tries to round somebody up there who will tell him who owns this post office box number. Okay. Fast forward. It's Sunday morning. At about 9:30 Sunday morning, he gets a telephone call from one of his strippers who lived in Fort Worth. Her name was Little Lynn. And Little Lynn had not been paid that weekend because Ruby had closed his nightclubs. And her landlord was pressing her for money, and she needed money for food. So Ruby said, okay, I'm going to go downtown, because he was still trying to find out what was happening with this assassination and Oswald and so forth. So he goes to the Western Union office, which is 1 block from where Oswald is being held by the Dallas police, and he stands in line, gives them $25, sends a Western Union money order to Little Lynn, and 4 minutes before he shoots Oswald, he's there at the Western Union office. Now, if this was a planned conspiratorial shooting, you got to think about this a little bit. In addition, I should tell you that in this trip down to the Western Union office, he brought his favorite dog, Sheba, and left the dog in the car in the parking lot. You have to decide the answer to this question yourself, but I'll tell you what the decision was of Jack Revel, who was a Dallas police officer who basically was in charge of looking after organized crime in Dallas. And when Jack Revel testified before the House Select Committee on Assassinations, that was one that I think Howard referred to here, that conducted its investigation in 1976, Jack Ruby was asked the question about whether Ruby was involved with organized crime. And here's his answer. If Jack Ruby was a member of organized crime needs a new HR director. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Those stories are remarkable. Justice?
Yes.
Mosk? Those
Question?
stories are remarkable, remarkable.
You know, over the last 49 years, once in a while I give a little talk about the Warren Commission, and usually on some anniversary, and it sort of reminds me, my father, who was Justice Stanley Mosk in the California Supreme Court, once gave a commencement address at USC, and after he gave his address, a student's mother came gushing down and said, "Oh, Justice Mosk, every speech you give is better than the next one." I was after graduating law school, I was one of the few people who ended up in the military at that time because I was a little bit younger, and I was languishing out at Amarillo Air Force Base. And that's the time when the assassination took place. And I had some time between when I was going to be released and when I was going to begin a clerkship. So I wrote the commission and said, can I be of any help? And ultimately, they accepted. I did know the Chief Justice, my father and he were friends, and I also was a friend of his, so that certainly helped. When I went back to California, I had to go to my Air Force base there, and I was going to, I went in uniform, and I was going to fly a red-eye to get to Washington in my uniform so I could go for free. I didn't realize, Howard didn't tell me that they would pay my way. And so I went out to the base in this nice shiny uniform, and they said, "All right, Mosk, you're going to do KP, which is kitchen patrol." And not only that, I had to do pots and pans. So there I was, pretty grimy. I flew all night to get to Washington. I was ushered into the Chief Justice's chambers, which was quite a difference, and he told me, he said, "Richard, truth is our only client." And I think that was his motto, and that was the motto of all of us. I was like a first-year associate at a law firm. We had the senior partners, and we had the junior partners, and I was the first-year associate, and that gave me the opportunity to work across every line. I worked very hard in those days. It was almost 7 days a week and 12 to 14 hours a day. We all worked very hard. Indeed, sometime thereafter, my mother told the Chief Justice, "You know, Richard really worked hard. When he went to get married, he left on a Friday night and got married Saturday, drove back Sunday, and was at work on Monday." And the chief said, "Well, who gave him Saturday off?" I worked on taking directions from Howard Willens. I worked on a number of things, and I just want to quickly go through them, and it shows the kinds of things that a first-year associate in an operation like this worked on. I dealt with the authority to issue subpoenas, in fact, drafted the first subpoena. There were some oddball things. In the Dallas Herald, there were some ads right before the assassination that said something like, "Running man, help me, Lee," or some variation of that. And that looked a little suspicious, and so I found out that it was actually a sort of a subtle ad for a motion picture called Running Man, starring Lee Remick, who was then a well-known actress. I also looked at all of Oswald's reading material, his books. For example, one of them was Huey Long, the Huey Long murder case. Another one was John Kennedy's Profiles in Courage. He actually was fairly well read if he read these books, the ones that he checked out of the library. I did a biography of Oswald, tracing his movements day by day. I recall one instance when it turned up there was a picture of a lady from Solvang, California, taking a picture of her friend, also from Solvang, in Minsk. And they were obviously taking a picture in front of some kind of a Russian church. And in the background was Lee Harvey Oswald, just walking by. They didn't take a picture of him, he just happened to be in the photograph. And I always was wondering, how did this picture turn up? And I've been told that in those days when tourists went to Russia, since we had so little information in many instances about Russia, the agencies, whether the CIA or somebody, would ask all tourists to give them their pictures. And I guess they went through all these pictures and found this thing, which was sort of amazing. I also, in order to determine whether or not Oswald had any other source of income, which would suggest the possibility of a conspiracy, we checked into his finances, and I tracked down all of his expenditures and all of his income, and then an IRS agent that we had there put it in the form of an income and expense statement. And it was almost embarrassing because it came out, there had to be some estimates. It came out that the income and the expenses were like $6 apart, which suggests that there was no other source of income. In that regard, I even tracked down his Time magazine subscription, which was like $4 or something, and I wanted to authenticate every expenditure, and I called Time magazine, asked for the head of circulation, and I said, this is Richard Mosk, the President's Commission on the Assassination of President Kennedy. He said, well, what business is that again? And I said, the Warren Commission, and he said, yeah. I said, we'd like the subscription of Lee Harvey Oswald. He said, well, where does he live now? I said, this is Time magazine. I also looked into his marksmanship ability. He had been a hunter as a young boy, and he was in the Marine Corps and qualified as a marksman. He was on a hunting club in Russia. When he came back to the United States, he had this rifle, and he used to go out and, according to his wife, and practice. And those of you who live in Dallas can see it was a relatively easy shot. Even I, with my limited military background, I think could master that. I also did I worked on a history of presidential protection, and at that time they allowed the president to be in an open vehicle, and if you see films of him then you would shudder at the type of protection that he had. I worked with Dave Slauson, for Dave Slauson, on the State Department issues. I worked on the proposal that the assassination of the president be a federal crime. Unbelievably, at that time, although federal judges and other federal officials, the killing of them would be a federal crime, it was not a federal crime to assassinate the President of the United States, and accordingly, that's why it would have to have been tried in a state court. I did work on some of these evidentiary issues that was alluded to by the United States Attorney on marital privilege, on the use of Walker, the attempt on General Walker, whether that would be admissible as a prior act or some other basis. I never quite understood why I did that assignment, because we weren't a court of law, and the evidentiary issues really didn't matter, although I suppose one could, with the exception of privileges, one could say that it dealt with or could be construed as how valid the evidence was or how strong the evidence was. If it wasn't admissible in a court of law, maybe it wasn't very strong evidence. But in any event, I did those assignments. So basically, at the end, I did have to leave a little bit early. When I first came to the commission, they said, well, my military obligation was that I had to go on weekends for duty, and they shifted it to Andrews Air Force Base. And I went to Senator Russell's office, and they said, look, this is all one government. What would you rather have me do? Work on the assassination of President Kennedy, the Warren Commission, federal government, or would you like me to go out and spend my time on the weekends as a clerk typist, as an airman third class? Which is your, what's more important to you? And they said, well, you got to do your military duty. And they finally said, well, you can, we'll let you off of it, but you have to make it all up. And so pretty soon, all of these weekends were starting to accumulate, and I thought I might have to spend the rest of my life, out at some Air Force base. So I did leave the commission a little bit early, and they asked me to come back for a week to help finish things up. I'm very proud of the product that was produced, and very proud of my colleagues. I think they all work very hard and diligently, and I fully support the Warren Commission's conclusions. Thanks very much.
Justice Pollack.
Well, good morning. In 1963, having completed my year of clerkship, I was working as a so-called special assistant in the criminal division of the Justice Department in Washington, and Howard Willens was my boss at the time. Like just about everybody else who was alive at that time, I can remember very clearly learning of the shooting of the president, because at that time I was sitting in the office with Howard and with his boss, head of the criminal division, and we received word that the president had been shot. And I was the youngest member. I was dispatched to the library to find out what the basis of federal jurisdiction is and what the federal crime was and what the basis for the federal government to take charge of the matter was. And as Richard just mentioned to you, the answer, which I quickly learned, was that there really was no federal jurisdiction. It was not at the time a crime to shoot the president. And I don't know, those of you who have seen the Parkland movie or read about what's in that movie, you remember the confrontation that took place between the federal officials and the state officials as to the ability to remove the president's body. I'm not really sure whether my advice to Howard and his boss had reached them down there at the time, but certainly the feeling was that the circumstances were grave enough that the federal government was going to take it over, despite the fact that it was not then, there really wasn't a basis for federal jurisdiction. After the shooting of Oswald and the formation of the commission, Howard, as he indicated, became initially the emissary between the Justice Department and the Commission. And he asked me to join him over there and to work with the Commission. And as a reflection of my own poor judgment, at the time, one of the deals I had struck when I had agreed to work in the criminal division was that they promised to send me over to the U.S. Attorney's Office to give me an opportunity to actually try a number of criminal cases. And I was just scheduled to do that. And so when Howard asked me to join him initially, I said no, I was going to hold him to his word. And I went over and I tried street crimes in the U.S. Attorney's Office for several months. But when that period ended, I had a few convictions under my belt. I came back and Howard contacted me again, and I was, I think, loaned from the Justice Department to the Commission and worked there on the staff until its work was completed. And I will say that of all the things I had done before, all the things I have done since, never has there been a more intense period of work in my personal life. It was 24/7, 7 days a week, not all that much sleep, long hours. It was a task that was taken very seriously and with a group of colleagues who were equally devoted, conscientious. By the time I got there, the conclusions, the basic conclusions, were pretty much clear. There was not any real doubt on anybody's mind as to the ultimate conclusion, but there were things to pin down. And my task, actually, I was involved primarily in the writing of portions of the report, reorganizing, editing, writing. But the instruction that I received, I recall very clearly when I got there, was in putting these things down in writing. It was essential to go back and be sure that everything was documented and pinned down, and wherever you found any gaps, something was missing, to initiate follow-up investigation to pin down whatever was missing. And we did that. In fact, one of the sort of humorous things I recall is one of the things that was mentioned, one of the felt important, was tracing the travels of Oswald when he traveled down to Mexico City and try to be sure that he hadn't come in contact with other people who might have been involved in some way. And it had been reported that he had been seen on this bus eating bananas. And we thought, well, wait a minute. If he's eating bananas, he must have got those bananas somewhere. And we sent a directive over to the FBI. We wanted them to go to every grocery store all the way down from wherever it began, all the way down to Mexico City, with a picture of Oswald and ask him if they remember this man buying any bananas. Well, the FBI, so I think someone understandably said, wait a minute, what are these young kids telling us? Here I was, about 26 years old, and they said, wait a minute, they're wasting a lot of federal resources. But we did our darndest to pin down all of the details. Another episode I remember, I was involved particularly in writing the portion of the report dealing with the shooting of Oswald in the police department and what was going on in the police department at the time. And I was sent down. I went down to the Pentagon where they had all the facilities, and every that shooting was covered by an awful lot of media. Unfortunately, there was the press was in there. It was bedlam, but there was a lot of footage. And I remember sitting in the room in the Pentagon, watching and rewatching and watching in slow motion over and over again every bit of that footage to see if you could detect any sign of anybody else in that room looking towards Ruby or doing anything that suggested that they might have anticipated what was to happen. And literally hours, of course, finding nothing in that footage that suggested any such thing. Another task that I received towards the end, I was directed to go through the report and submit a memo suggesting whether there are any deletions that ought to be made from the report, that any materials that were included in the report that were either defamatory of individuals or undue invasions of people's privacy that really were not particularly relevant and were unduly intrusive for one reason or another. And I submitted a long list of just references to bystanders, criminal convictions, or references to personal matters that really had no bearing. But interestingly, and it was a long list, I forget exactly how many pages it was, but of all the suggestions I made of the things that ought to be taken out, there were only a very few that were accepted. Most of it was kept in there, and the whole objective of the report was to put out all the facts and not to conceal anything. And as I say, there was very little that was ultimately decided to be so irrelevant and so intrusive that it should be deleted. In any event, having spent that time, since, in the years since, I was involved in a number of trials as both as a lawyer and then later as a judge, and comparing the work that goes into any trial, whether it's a criminal prosecution or any other kind of trial, in which lots of lawyers do a lot of work, never has there been an investigation as intense and as thorough as was taking place and took place in the work of the Commission. We've learned over time there were imperfections. Nobody suggests that we did everything perfect. In fact, I think any lawyer who has ever tried a case, you walk into that courtroom to start the trial, you always have the feeling that there's one more thing you could have done, should have done. You're never completely done with your work. And I think what has happened subsequently, things that we have learned since that investigation, proves that that's true there. But the thoroughness and the intensity and the desire of everybody involved in that task to serve the truth, to lay out the whole story was unquestionable. And I think, as has been mentioned already, in the years since, although we have learned of some imperfections and some things we didn't know, nothing, in my judgment at least, has come to light in the almost 50 years since that report that casts any credible doubt on the ultimate conclusions to which the Commission came. There was one shooter. He acted alone. He acted without the involvement of any other person. I think there was no question in the minds of us who were working night and day at that time as to the truth of that conclusion. And today, 50 years later, still no doubt. Thank you.
Thank you so much. It's been my privilege to do nothing here today, but to enjoy all of this conversation. I do want to share with you, because Judge Sanders, the United States Attorney, the Chief Federal Law Enforcement in North Texas at the time, is not here as a sixth panelist to share his experiences at the time. His conclusions with respect to what you were just talking about, when he was asked in the oral history for the Fifth Circuit Court of Appeals about his office's involvement in the Warren Commission activities, he said, and I will quote, "We were not involved with apprehending him." They were asking about Oswald in particular. "We were involved with the Warren Commission setup. They set up originally in my office for a matter of a few weeks until they got some permanent quarters." Anybody remember that? "And I was very impressed with the thoroughness of the way they were going about finding out all they could about who should be checked. And I'm satisfied they did everything they could. I have been satisfied with their report ever since." So that is a personal note to myself. I feel I can rely on this personal opinion. I just wanted to share that with you all. Thank you very much.
Thank you.